Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by Red Thread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Welcome to Workplace Stories. I'm Stacia Garr. Our guest today is Jennifer McCollum, who is the president and CEO of Catalyst, a global nonprofit that has been at the forefront of women's advancement for 65 years. She's also the author of a new book called Men at Work, The Roadmap to Gender Partnership. Now, I'll be honest, when I first saw the title, I had a few questions. Why is the organization focused on advancing women writing a book about men? And also, why at this moment? If you've been paying attention to the DEI space over the last few years, you know the landscape has shifted dramatically. Programs have been restructured, titles have changed, budgets have been absorbed, and a lot of leaders are trying to figure out how to keep doing work they believe in inside an environment that is so much more complicated. But what Jennifer brought to the conversation is something that's a bit different. She posits that what if the reason we've stalled on gender equity isn't just that organizations aren't trying hard enough, but that we've been trying to solve it without fully bringing half the workforce into the solution. In this episode, we get into the data on why workplaces are failing men in addition to women, and what that actually means strategically. We talk about Catalyst's new earned universalism framework, and Danny asked some pretty sharp questions on accountability. We also get into what HR practitioners can actually do with this information, especially if their DEIB function has been restructured into something else. And Jennifer tells a story about a leader at a major staffing company who told thousands of his employees live, "I got it wrong the first time. Here's what I'm doing differently." I think you're going to find loads of really significant, thoughtful comments in this particular podcast episode. And we are just thrilled that Jennifer McCollum joined us. We hope that you enjoyed the podcast and feel free to let us know afterwards what you think. Welcome to Workplace Stories. Jennifer, we are so excited to have you with us here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Such a pleasure to be with you, Stacia and Danny.
So you are the CEO of Catalyst, but our listeners will quickly find out that you and I worked together a long time ago. I would love for you to just tell folks a bit about yourself, about the work that Catalyst does, and particularly about high level, this new book that you've brought out.
Perfect. Well, thank you for raising the fact that we did in fact work together, Stacia. You were a baby 17 years ago. And by the way, the world was very, very different. If you remember, at the midst of the Great Recession, the leadership space was really about conferences and in-person training and development. But at the time, and you have continued this, we had access to amazing data and amazing insight that we turned into development experiences. I ended up, over the course of not only the last 17 years, but even 10 years before that, moving more deeply into the leadership space and then further and further into the women's leadership space. So we worked together 17 years ago. Sheryl Sandberg wrote Lean In 2013. McKinsey started their Women in the Workplace report with Sheryl and Lean in 2016. And then the world changed pretty radically. It was the Me Too movement. It was COVID. It was Black Lives Matter. And there was this real meteoric rise of the CDO, the CDEIO, DEIB. And then the last couple of years, there's been this similarly dramatic fall from 24 to 2026. So I find myself in my work in the midst of a cycle where the world has so fundamentally shifted. And that's what makes my work so fun. So quick note about myself. I live still in the Washington, D.C. area where I met you. I've been there for the 20 plus years, raising 3 fantastic kids who are now the last is headed off to college, 28th anniversary. But throughout the course of my career and the 28 years of my marriage, we've both had very significant career trajectories. And I've lived that life of being a woman, being a leader, a mother, a caregiver. And so being in this leadership space at mostly professional services firms across the last 17 years and as a consultant before that has really given me a front row seat into leadership. So about Catalyst, this is my second CEO job. My first one was the private equity-backed company called Linkage. It was a leadership development firm that for 25 years really drove research, insight, conferences, assessments, coaching to support making the world's leaders better. And it was in that job as a first-time CEO and the first woman CEO of Linkage that I looked inside this treasure trove of data that Linkage had on women, on what prevents women from rising, on how we can more effectively support women in organizations, and developing the women themselves. And I did that as the CEO for 6 years, and it sold to the Society for Human Resource Management, now known as, I'm sure your listeners are all very well aware of SHRM. And it was under Linkage that I wrote my first book, in her own voice, A Woman's Rise to CEO. When SHRM integrated and I left at the end of the Linkage acquisition and integration, it was the end of 2023. And Catalyst was looking for a new CEO. Catalyst has for 65 years been the world's largest global nonprofit focused on accelerating progress for women in the workforce. And the thing I love about Catalyst is that it's really the opposite side of the coin that Linkage had. Linkage was focused on the women themselves. Catalyst is focused on the systems, the structures, the leadership, and the culture that will support progress for women in the workforce. And our credo is when workplaces work for women, they work for everyone, including men. And that might be the kind of the tie then that will lead us to the next part of our conversation.
Jennifer, you say that we're in a really interesting time right now. Why should we listen to you and to Catalyst?
Yes, we are in a very interesting time. The last few years has been a wild ride for many of us, both from a social, political, economic, and by extension in the corporate world, especially for the field of HR. So why listen to me? Why listen to Catalyst? Well, we have been driving data, research, and insight on the workplace for 40 years. More importantly, in this period of time, we have a corporate board made up of Fortune 500 company CEOs, and they are highly committed to ensuring that they can continue to attract and retain and engage all talent, but especially don't want to leave behind half the world's talent when it comes to gender. Danny, they were so clear to me. I had been the CEO of Catalyst maybe for 60 days, starting in April of 2024, when they saw the pendulum swing even faster than perhaps I did. And they came to me and said, Jennifer, to sustain the mission and to sustain this organization, we must position this work as linked to winning in the marketplace, as linked to organizational performance. And therefore, you must stay center of the fairway, to use a bad sports analogy. Don't embarrass us. Don't fight the food fight you can't afford to lose. So that meant I had to let go of things that we held very true for a long time, the specific language of DEI, including all of the words of the acronyms, the social justice, and this is the right thing to do, in addition to it's the smart thing to do. I had to soften those types of things. They wanted to make sure we weren't calling any company out, either for good or not so good, and how they were responding to the executive orders. So those were the types of things that happened a year ago. What we're seeing now is, and this was reflected in a European board member when he said, Jennifer, everything has changed and nothing has changed. The commitment is there, but our language, our positioning, our access to and reporting of data, these are things we're taking very seriously because we need to sustain our organizations while continuing to drive our mission and our work forward.
It's so interesting that they came to you during that time. You said like April of 24. It definitely was in anticipation or before some of the changes that we began to see. I just find that fascinating. I want to talk a bit about the book because I think that these things are interwoven. So the basic premise is, as you kind of alluded to with Catalyst's whole mission and language, is that workplaces weren't necessarily built for women, but they're also failing men. And so help us first understand that case. What's the data that supports it? And why does it matter that we look at both sides, not just the it's failing women side?
And I'm really glad that you started that way, Stacia, because some of the skeptics will say, why is Catalyst, an organization focused on advancing women, writing a book called Men at Work? I consistently point to the subtitle called The Roadmap to Gender Partnership. And this is never to denigrate or dismiss the real and critical challenges women have always faced in the workplace. That's why Catalyst was conceptualized 65 years ago. So the data is very well accessible. Catalyst still has it, or we track it, or we partner with it. We look at labor market statistics, we look at pay equity statistics, board representation, and all senior leader representation. And while we have made a lot of progress over the last 15 years, progress has not only stalled in many cases, it's actually regressing in some. Pay equity and board representation as example. So those are real challenges, and we continue to dig under the why and how to solve them. However, not only do we know we cannot solve them without engaging executives and senior leaders, the vast majority of whom are still men, we also know now through our research that workplaces are not always working for men either. And what surprised us was when we did our most recent research, it was in the context of why aren't men stepping up for women? But what we uncovered in that research is many men are feeling this very intense pressure to conform to these pretty rigid expectations about what it means to be a man. And men moves right into the workplace, but it limits not only men, it limits all of us, because men are still by and large in the positions of power and influence in creating culture and leading teams. So to data you asked for, 82% of men are feeling a lot of pressure to conform to stereotypes, driven, competitive, solitary, aggressive, things that don't necessarily serve them well. 75% of them will say, I actually don't feel authentic when I'm expected to act that way. And 87% are saying, I want it to feel more acceptable to express traits like empathy, like kindness. So we call that the man box. What will it take? We never use the word toxicity, male toxicity, masculine toxicity ever, because this is not about a person. It's about the conditions, the box that we place around men in the very same way we do with women when we're expected to operate with a different set of character.
I think this point around that the organizations are failing or particularly challenging for men is important. I remember a number of years ago, one of the pieces of research that most struck me, and this was way pre-pandemic, but that the work-life stress for men was actually higher than for women. And the reason for that was that it goes back to the systems and the expectations. So there was an unwritten assumption that if a woman said, hey, I got to leave at 3 to go grab my kids from school, it was like, okay, like annoying, but whatever, right? Effectively, like that nobody would have actually said that, but we all know that that's what the subtext was in their head. But if a man said, hey, I got to leave at 3 to go pick up my kids, it'd be like, wait, you're not like fully dedicated to this? Like what? There was that tension, that unstated tension and assumption around who behaves and does what, particularly with regard to out of office things that have to happen. And so I think that you're all kind of calling this out is an extrapolation of that beyond just the within or the between home and work tension, but overall. Like there's a whole lot of things that don't work, particularly as standards are changing. I think I just saw yesterday that for the first time or more recently that the percentage of dual income households has increased. It was a headline just a couple of days ago. As this truly, truly becomes more of the norm, these tensions are going to be harder for everyone.
Yeah, and I think we may get into the framework in the book that gets to really practical solutions to this. There's a piece of our framework called Build Up What's in It for Men. And so it's really dispelling this myth that work-life integration is a women's issue. It's actually a human issue. And when men are able to break out of that bandbox and be a little bit more explicit about, And there's a story in the book around Dow that Amy Wilson, the general counsel of Dow, this is now 20 years ago, arrived at Dow and the general counsel said, chop, chop, we got to finish this meeting at 5:00. I've got to watch my kid play baseball. She said she almost fell out of her chair because actually watching men model, like, I will not miss this, is part of creating the culture of, oh, wait a minute, gender partnership not only helps women, it actually helps men too. And that's an example of that.
I love that. This conversation up to this point has given me RBG vibes, like very much like the way that she approached gender equality. Seems to be sort of the same take you all are.
Yeah, I mean, that was the brilliance of RBG. I have my little, here, I have to show you now. She's with me all the time, like on my windowsill. And the reason is because she was so brilliant in her invitation. It's like, we're actually going to talk about men who want to be nurses, and I'm going to fight equally for that as for the women who want to be scientists. Anyway, rip RBG.
In some of your research that you're doing with the Metzler Center at NYU, you introduced a term, earned universalism. I'm wondering if you could explain that to our audience.
So one of the, I think, things I'm most proud of about Catalyst, and this goes back a year ago. Like I said, I started in 2024. The pendulum started to swing. The election happened. January, you'll remember, the very first executive order had a massive impact on our sector. We went straight to the Meltzer Center, the NYU School of Law, and they had, it's called the Meltzer Center of Diversity, Inclusion, Belonging. Kenji Yoshino and David Glasgow have become very important partners to us. They are the world's foremost experts in constitutional DEI law. And we pulled them close because we knew that at Catalyst, we had the business and the kind of the social aspects of this, but not necessarily the legal aspects and the political aspects. And this was so critical. We did the first study called The Risk of Retreat. It released about a year ago. And it was the largest study in the post-E.O. 90 days. We gathered the data, then we aggregated and released it within 6 months of the executive orders. And that was critical because it provided early guidance to all these organizations flailing around trying to figure out, like, do I fight? Do I flee? Or do I finesse? The vast majority finessed, and we helped them do that. So we helped them make sense of what was happening and how to make sure that you weren't increasing your risk, whether it's from a legal or a reputational or a talent or a financial perspective. Fast forward to your question 1 year later. And this is research we plan to do every single year. This year we went, okay, now we are a year and a half into this. What is the future path to inclusion? We started to isolate, and this was very clear in the data. If you're a government contractor, you have a set of expectations, concerns, and risks that non-government contractors don't. So we saw that highly differentiated approach. But regardless, there was this continued and understandable deep-seated commitment to inclusion because it links to business performance. So you mentioned earned universalism. It's a new concept that we are offering as a path forward, as guidance. And it basically acknowledges that we're not asking organizations, it doesn't ask organizations to walk away. Like, please don't walk away from the concept of equity or fairness. We just need to fight for it a little bit differently. And so here's the huge paradox. Even though the vast majority of employees and leaders alike want inclusion efforts to benefit everyone, we also need to ensure that we're still prioritizing those who have benefited the least. So this is this real paradox of, we got to benefit everybody, but hey, what about those women? Or what about the differently abled? Or what about LGBTQ+? And so this is a unification strategy, but also suggests that we have to earn the right to focus on everyone by proving that we're actually removing very specific barriers. And I'll use a super specific example because it's been one that I'm sure you have been talking about a lot, and that's this whole flexibility challenge. So if the universal goal is to ensure we retain high performance and retention, especially in this post-COVID era where return to office has been such a challenge, how do we ensure that we have policies in place that benefit everyone, so flexible work policies that benefit everyone, while understanding that there are uneven life constraints, especially for the caregivers who by and large are mostly women. So what do leave policies look like? What do returnship policies look like so that everyone benefits, but it also addresses systemic barriers?
Okay. What do organizations have to give up to put something like that in place?
Well, I mean, this is what's ironic is when you start talking about how everyone benefits, you're not really giving up. There's the perception that you're giving up on any one intersection that isn't a specific focus anymore. But I think that what Catalyst would say is we're not necessarily focused as much on the who. We're focused on the what is standing in their way. And what you have to give up is promising very specific outcomes to any one intersection. As an example, we had many organizations that were committed to, we will have 33% women in all leadership ranks by 2030. While we give that up on paper, you're still committed to ensuring workplace policies that will make that result happen anyway.
So it's more about the system and the process that is in place versus the outcome, a specific outcome for a specific group. Is that fair to say?
Right. So before we were very public, the organizations that supported Catalyst, CEO champions for change. We had 88 CEOs in our network who were very visibly and verbally committed to specific representation number, whether it was boards or senior leadership positions or pay equity. I would say that they're still largely committed to those. What's different is holding yourselves accountable to any set of outcome metrics aligned to any specific subsection of the workforce, because that's where the risk comes in. So the Kenji and David framework around the 3 Ps, does this provide preferential treatment to a protected class with palpable benefit? Those are what will, in the United States, that is what will put you at risk. So you're giving up those things, but instead you are still focused on how do we remove bias from our system so they're fair for everyone. How do we continue another thing you're giving up is this whole universal focus. This specific focus, and you've got to open everything up. So in some ways you're giving up things like, very safe spaces where only women met or only LGBTQ plus met. So this open to all, which many ERGs or BRGs were already open to all before with their allyship programs. But those are the types of things, perceived or real, that you're giving up to ensure you're maintaining the group focus, you're still removing bias from the systems. And we actually think that the practice of gender partnership and demonstrating how when everyone is contributing to a fair and equal workplace, everyone actually benefits, the underrepresented group, men and especially white men.
This might seem like a super nuanced question. I can understand the sort of giving up. These are the things that you give up in order to do it this way. What about just switching that question a little bit to what do you lose by doing it this way versus doing it the traditional way? Is there a different answer there?
I think, again, let's just take another real specific example, pay equity. We had organizations very committed to looking at and reporting their pay audits and fixing any gaps in those audits. So what are they losing? Nothing. They're still continuing to do it. What is Catalyst losing? Well, we're losing access to that data where we can aggregate all of those organizations and demonstrate what best in class looks like, because now we don't have as much public access to the data because there's a lot more concern about whether it's tracking the data or reporting on the data either internally or externally. So I don't see that the organizations are losing much. But I do worry about, from a mission perspective, we are losing a little bit of kind of visibility, access, reporting, highlighting best practice because of the real fear in the United States.
It also feels like, and I could be completely wrong here, like I love the way that this is moving. Like, let's just fix the system for everybody. Everybody's better. But at the same time, if there's less noise about how unfair it is and how we need to fix it to make it more fair, it feels like there's less accountability for organizations to actually adhere. You know what I mean? One thing that I thought was really interesting during like the Me Too movement and George Floyd and all that is everybody got really vocal about stuff and was very accountable to stuff. And we can fix the systems, but that sort of pressure or accountability I don't know that it's there anymore. Is it there?
Well, let's just play that backward and forward. So I would say it created a lot more visibility. It created a lot more pointing fingers, especially at what best practice does not look like. And it created a lot of performative action that I think when the pendulum swung very far, I think perhaps the DEI, DEIB movement, the disservice that happened was the inadvertent or not blame, shame, exclusion, largely of men. And when you look at what's happening now, I know this may be a different place than you wanted to go, but when you look at what's happening now with kind of the rise of the manosphere and the real focus on the plight of boys and men, I think it might be a reaction to how far the pendulum had swung the other way. So that this gender partnership concept, this invitation to when we all feel accountable and we all feel like we can contribute, but we also all feel like we can benefit, is it a different frame so that it's more welcoming as opposed to either performative or actual kind of blaming and shaming?
One of the things that I think is interesting about this is potentially the unintended benefits that can happen. When you think about universal design, for instance, it is, a single use case, if you will, may have inspired it, but it can translate into things that benefit others. So the example I always think of in my head is the ADA sidewalks and the need to be able to roll a wheelchair up and down those. I can tell you that when I had a stroller and I was pushing my babies, I appreciated those sidewalks like nobody's business. And plenty of other folks do. I've got an older dad and he shuffles and he appreciates those as well. And so, I think the thing that will be interesting to see is what other benefits potentially come out of this more universal approach. I was going to say universalistic, but that didn't work. What comes out of this universal approach for broader groups that maybe we haven't been thinking about?
Well, it also surfaces the opportunity for culture shift. I'll give you a specific example. So we've been talking about pushing strollers, but when you look at parental benefits, I think one of the things that has come out of a lot of our work with our supporter base engaging with us in MARC, which now stands for Mutual Accountability for Real Change. And we're bringing leaders together at different levels to build awareness and talk about and practice the very concepts that embody gender partnership. And I think one of the things that came up in multiple companies, and this is in the book in Chevron, it happened at Dow, it also happened at Sanofi, where the conversations around parental leave, what really favored the birthing mother. And that the birthing father or the adoptive parents weren't necessarily gaining the same benefit. So it surfaced as what might it look like for the birthing father also to have the same parental leave. And, it's kind of at the time was a fairly foreign concept, at least in the United States. And there were two problems. One was the policy shift, but two was making it acceptable to take the benefit itself. And so there's multiple stories in the book. The Sanofi one comes to mind out of Europe, where Paul Hudson, the then CEO, not only created equity universally in the policy, but also set the expectation culturally that men also would be taking the full 16 weeks. Well, that benefited women hugely, because what's the biggest fear? And it's backed up by data. When women take leave, for every successive child she has, not only does her pay go down, but her opportunity does as well. The same was not true of men. So when men are taking the leave, it actually puts them on the same playing field. But then, of course, it also benefits the men because, back to, childcare should not be it should be a human opportunity, not a female opportunity. So it allowed them the leave that created a different parenting bond with the child.
Super interesting. Let's take a moment and go to our lightning round questions so folks get to know you a little bit better, Jennifer. And I'm going to go with the softball, I think, as a first one, which is, what is your proudest achievement?
Well, I've already told you about my fabulous husband and kids, so I'm not going to start there. I'm going to talk about a professional achievement, which was not that long ago. So November of 23. A lot of things were coming together. I've mentioned a little bit. I had been the CEO of Linkage for 5 years. We had sold it to SHRM, and I'd stayed for a year to help manage the integration. It was all coming to an end, and I was proud of what was going on. It was kind of my bucket list to be a CEO and to transform and sell a company. But, as the CEO who was acquired, I knew it probably wasn't going to last. SHRM had a CEO. They didn't need another one. But it was also at that exact time that my first book, In Her Own Voice, that I referenced, also launched. And this is a story about my father. So my father he was far more enamored with my career than most people, which started at the Coca-Cola Company, where I traveled the world going to very high profile events like the Olympics and the World Cup. But he always saw me as an author and a speaker on large stages. And he wanted me to write a book. And I just kept saying, like, Dad, my story is not that interesting. But when I was at Linkage, we had the data and the frameworks and the insight to bring to life my stories through differentiated IP. So when I wrote that book on the exact stage in November of 23, my 82-year-old father, my mother, my 3 kids, and 3,000 other people were on the stage as Johnny, the CEO of SHRM, introduced me. I led the keynote from the stage. We launched the book. My father was crying in the audience. Within 60 days, I had started as the CEO of Catalyst. So I think that from a professional perspective, I think that was the peak of my, well, I don't want to say peak. It's still all going fine.
The most recent peak. Last question is, would you rather speak 10 languages or play 10 instruments?
This is so easy for me. So I was born in Germany. I studied in Spain. I went to graduate school in Scotland. I lived in and worked in Chile, and I traveled the world with Coca-Cola. So I've always been fascinated by connecting with people through language. Ideally, and I speak fluent Spanish and some German, ideally in a language that, we can share together. So connection with humans real time is always going to be my love language. And I'm a little, I don't know, I think I'm enamored by the idea that, like, with our AI glasses, we might be able to, like, speak each other's language much more easily. I just want to make sure we don't lose the human connection and all of that.
For sure. Okay, let's turn a little bit towards what HR leaders should be doing with this. We've got a number of practitioners who were listening and who are our members who were DEIB leaders, and their role has been structured into something else, something broader, typically culture, talent, HR ops, something like that. And they're still wanting to do this work, particularly around inclusion and fairness and diversity of perspectives, et cetera. But they have to, you mentioned it earlier, the language is a trigger. The language can be a trigger. So how does this focus on gender partnership go more broadly? It's not a DEIB thing. It's not a thing connected to specific language. Like, how do we make it relevant and something that HR leaders can do something about it?
Yeah, well, and first, thank you for acknowledging. And I think for all of us and all of your listeners who have or were practicing in some piece of the DEIBA space, it's been a wild and very challenging ride over the last 2 years, especially as departments are blown up or eliminated, but mostly the work continues in different forms. So as you mentioned, can we move this concept of gender partnership and the skill set associated into talent, culture, leadership development? At its heart, this is a leadership and cultural opportunity. Catalyst has an inclusive leadership framework, as many organizations do. And we're looking at the very skills that things like leading with humility or curiosity or courage, leading outwardly with kind of ownership, accountability, allyship. These are things that we know will link to organizational performance, but they also become even more important in a world of AI. So we did not plan to talk about this today, but I want to just plant the seed that our brand new research, it emanated out of Europe, is called The Convergent Leader. And it's about the evolution of leadership skills required as humans and machines continue to increase in the need to collaborate. And what we found was that, yes, we all need to deepen our AI technical skills, but in this environment especially, our inclusive leadership skills and our learning agility skills become even more important. So all to say, to answer your question, the more we can pull this into, it's the leadership and the culture required for us to move our organization and hit our aspirational performance and business goals, that will be where this work is more accepted. The only other thing I would say is there's a whole nother movement I'm sure you're tracking, which is about the integration of the ERG, VRG type groups. So I was just at Ron last week where Mike, the CEO, who's in the book many times and was one of the largest founders and funders of our Mark work when he was the executive sponsor of their women's executive network about a decade ago. He sat on the stage with me last week, and he talked about shifting these leadership capabilities that are comprised in gender partnership, shifting from awareness to accountability. And he said, we've been focused on awareness for a long time, but this is how we need to lead to drive our, talk about oil and gas is going through a moment right now. You need to lead in this way, and I expect you and will hold you accountable for leading this way, but I'm going to model it first. And I thought that was a really powerful, it was at their inclusion summit, and we were there. It was not a women's event. It was an ERG event with executive sponsors and leaders and participants, but the entire organization was invited to content that kind of wove its way through every ERG.
In your book, you explain your 5B model. I'm wondering if you can give us a quick overview of that, and then I have a follow-up question.
Yes. So what I love about the book is the first half of the book talks about the challenge before us, both for men and women in the workplace, the business case to drive change, a deeper understanding of how did actually we get here. There were, especially for men, like what is preventing them from kind of breaking out of that man box. So that's the first half of the book. Second half of the book goes into what is the solution. And so our 5B framework, not just for men, by the way, it's a leadership book, and gender partnership encompasses women supporting women, men supporting men, and men and women supporting each other. It's designed to start, it's a 5B framework. The first is begin with you. And that's the real self-reflection required to see the need and to drive the impetus for change. We can tell stories about all of these things. Mike is my actually favorite story because he talks about when he was the only man in the room full of a group of women executives earlier in his career and how challenging that was for him. He was sweaty palms, beating heart, and like, wow, I'm so aware that I'm the only. And then that kind of quick realization of this is what women face every single day. Like that was the beginning of his kind of awakening to this work. So that's begin with you. The second is break down what's not working. So we talked about some of the systemic things that aren't working. It could be access to the universalism that we were talking about, pay. It could be different benefits. It could be different access to opportunities. So that systemically, let's break down what's not working. In terms of leadership, it's breaking down what's not working as an individual leader. And this is where seeking feedback becomes very important. We talk in the book about David Simmons, who's a senior executive in Canada, and he is a very openly Black queer man who inadvertently was setting expectations for the working parents on his team, who were primarily women, because he was working out and finishing his email and in the office before 8, and he was working late at night, and the women felt like they couldn't keep up and they couldn't succeed, and he didn't know. So when his executive coach helped him to see what he was, the conditions he was creating inadvertently, that's not working. What do I personally need to do to change? And so that story is in the book. The 3 is build up what's in it for men. And we've talked about that a little bit already. Let's make sure that we create conditions for men and women equally across genders to talk about the challenge of work-life integration and what they're doing to solve it. And I was on a podcast or a big webcast with a huge staffing company, and the head of North America is this incredible man. And he was so vulnerable on the call. And he said to his entire team, there are thousands of people on the call, and he said, I got it wrong. I raised my first 2 kids and I was never available. I was traveling. My wife was working, but she was the primary caregiver. I missed a lot. I don't know the circumstances precisely, he said, but I had a chance for a do-over. And I'm raising my second set of kids now completely differently. And let me tell you, my team knows they will not reach me between the hours of 5 and 8 because I am home. I am helping put the kids to bed, and so the modeling of that, the chat blew up and they like hearts and emojis and thank you for modeling the way forward. And I thought, this is how change happens. And then I'll just really quickly, the 4th one is bridge the gender gap. So it's what can we do as leaders of all levels to actually model the way forward or to solve the systemic changes. And then the last one is, my favorite one, is bring humanity to work. And how do we acknowledge that we know so little about each other in the workplace? There was a story of one executive who went through our program and said, I learned more about my colleagues in 7 minutes than I had in 7 years of working with them directly. And it was because we created the conditions where we could become a lot more open with each other about not only our life experience, but how those experiences come into the workplace.
So I have maybe 2 questions. The first one is, we've done some research on manager effectiveness, and basically what it tells us is managers know what good looks like. They just don't have the time or the space in order to do it. When you were talking through this model, you were talking about what leaders need to do, and then systemically, what do we need to change? So I'm curious, in the organizations that you're talking to, how have you seen them make space for the leaders to do that? The second question is, what do the systems look like that help that happen?
It's such a great question. And I've seen the manager research for a long time about, really the impossible situation we're putting managers in. You have to translate the strategy and create the culture and implement new policy. And it's an important design question. What we know from our research as well is that it's so much easier for manager behavior to change when the system around them also changes. So there's a chapter in the book, I think it's chapter 4. There's individual aspects which prevent men from either standing up or breaking out of the man box, but there's also organizational aspects. So we know when there are cultures, we call them combative cultures or climates of silence, they are far less likely to either break out of the man box or speak up or be interested in change because they don't think it will serve them. So our hope is that this 5B framework and this kind of new consideration of gender partnership doesn't feel like another thing on your to-do list. It feels like changing the water that we swim in so we can all swim more effectively and swim more collectively as well. I think if it's a check the box exercise, it would never have worked anyway, past, present, or future.
So Jennifer, let's get down a little bit to brass tacks. If you were to come into an HR organization tomorrow that's trying to do this work, how would you suggest they approach it? So where do they start? And I kind of broke this question down into strategically, politically, and analytically, which I don't usually do. That's not a typical framework. But in this environment, there's a lot more kind of going on. So can you help me understand, where do they start? How do they think in these elements? And then what do they do next?
So I'm going to actually start politically. This is what is frankly saved Catalyst when the executive orders first came out, was when workplaces work for women, they work for everyone. We have never, and gender partnership is the best example, we have never been about any one subsection of the population, even though we're gender first. So politically, anything we're doing related to this leadership and cultural evolution with gender partnership is absolutely doesn't hit any of those 3 Ps I mentioned. So we're not only focused on a one protected class, we're not offering preferential treatment, and this isn't for palpable benefit for one over the other. So that box is checked. Analytically is a super interesting place to start, and then I'll go to strategically. And I'm going to use the example of, I didn't ask for permission, so I won't say their name, but it's a construction and engineering company, massive, privately held, kind of $50 billion. And they're looking analytically at all of their data and all of their build sites around the world and saying, from an engineering and a construction perspective, we have to attract women because we don't have enough talent to meet the aspirational growth goals of the organization. So they're looking at the data, they're seeing the challenge. Strategically, and I love this CEO. This CEO has said to his head of the HR team, and we work directly with the head of DEI, they still have that. He said, help me fix this problem. And so they brought Mark into their organization and kind of one build site after another around the world. So it started from the top. Now it's gone kind of grassroots, geographically by build site. And then we're creating sustainability through multiple tiers of the program. So we start with the senior leaders, we move into the frontline managers, and then it's kind of the front lines on the build site. And it's sustainable. I mean, we're doing this is woven into their leadership work, and we're doing it over the course of small touch points every single month, as opposed to like everyone leave the site for days on end. That's one example.
Well, unfortunately, we have to start wrapping up. This has been a fantastic conversation. Just 2 questions as we wrap up. I'll ask one and then leave the second one for Stacia. If listeners can only take one thing away from this conversation today, what would you want it to be?
Oh, well, I think, let me just get back to being kind of heavy, deep, and real like I started. The most honest thing I can say is that leading through this moment, especially in HR, has meant questioning everything. For Catalyst, we're not questioning the mission of accelerating progress for women, but we are questioning everything that we can do to ensure that it stays relevant. And I think that's what I get most excited about with gender partnership, because we know we were the first. We kind of invented the term sponsorship 30 years ago. We were the first to acknowledge that we cannot do this without men. But as we moved from sponsorship to allyship and ended up on partnership, we realized that it's even better to ask for men's contribution when they know that they need it and they can benefit as well.
Jennifer, I'm going to finish by asking you the question we ask every podcast guest, and that is the purpose question. So why do you do the work that you do?
Well, you were kind of there with me, Stacia, at the not the very beginning, but I spent many, many years, decades inside global companies, large corporate environments, and I built a career I was really proud of. As I moved through kind of business leadership roles, first of one team, then a team of teams, then a BU leader, then a CEO, I was watching leaders, who is getting rewarded and who is not, who got sponsored, who got stretch assignments, who got paid, who had to work, twice as hard, to be even considered half as ready for that promotion. And I lived through a lot of that. And my purpose really was unlocked, starting when we worked together at what was then CEB, now Gartner. When I started getting access to the data, then moving into linkage and realizing we can fix this. We have insight data, frameworks, programs that not only can impact the women directly, but now at Catalyst, we have all of that and more about how we can impact the systems, the cultures, and the leaders. And I think it's going to require organizations like Catalyst and hopefully leaders that, alongside me, believe strongly in the mission that when workplaces work for women, they work for everyone.
Jennifer McCollum, thank you so much for joining us on Workplace Stories.
Thank you both so much.
Thanks for listening. If this podcast got you thinking differently about how work happens, that's what we're here for. We dig into these topics every week in our research and in the Red Thread community. The Red Thread community is a place where people, leaders, and practitioners come together to compare notes, share what's working, and maybe challenge those things that aren't working so well. You can join for free at redthreadresearch.com/membership. Or if you or your organization are ready to go deeper, take a look at our professional and our enterprise memberships. For professional tier, for listeners, you can use the promotional code STORIES, STORIES, for a 10% discount. And if you're a tech provider trying to make sense of this space, our tech consortium is where smart vendors are coming together to learn from each other and from the market. You'll find everything at redthreadresearch.com. I'm Danny Johnson. Thanks for listening and for caring about making work better.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the Red Thread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.